It was early in the morning, and the sky had just brightened up slightly. Most of the alleys were dark and quiet. With the aid of Danitz's cloak, Klein blended into the shadows and quickly moved about. He felt as if his surroundings were grayish-black and transparent, with reality being blurred. All sounds seemed to come from the depths of the starry sky, empty and distant. After staying as far away from Amorous Avenue as possible, he acquired his bearings and grew out from the shadow. He appeared in an empty alley filled with broken stone. Klein's hands shook, throwing Steel Mavetti's peacock blue flying carpet out in front of him. He wanted to finish the grazing before Mavetti's spirit body began dissipating. Throwing away the flying carpet, he took a step forward, stretched out his left hand, and extended his 5 fingers, aiming from above at the corpse that was still warm. Creeping hunger revealed its original appearance, a thin material that looked like it was made up of human skin. 2 eyes had split open in the middle of its palm. Its pupils were bright red, as though they were dyed in blood. Whoosh! A bone-chilling breeze suddenly blew through the alley. It swirled around Steel Mavetti's corpse, twisting into an almost transparent human figure. One could vaguely see thick lips and curled hair that resembled steel beads. Mavetti's spirit body wore an abnormally pained expression as he tried his best to resist the suction of the creeping hunger. As for the grayish-white and blackish-green dots of light, they were like a surging galaxy, quickly flying out from his body and merging into the transparent figure. No! Mavetti let out a soundless scream, already being too late to beg for mercy. All he could do was desperately slip into the human-skinned glove, becoming attached to an empty finger, and revealing his Beyonder characteristic that connected with the environment to a certain extent. This connection determined what powers would be usable when grazing Steel Mavetti's soul. Perhaps it would be 1, 2, but no more than 3 powers. Klein had no choice over the number and details before they became fixed, as it was purely random. Creeping hunger quickly blanketed its paleness, and finally returned to its former disguised state, a plain black glove. Klein closed his eyes and sensed the changes for a few seconds before letting out a profound sigh. This time his luck wasn't bad, but it wasn't too good either. He had succeeded in acquiring 3 Beyonder powers belonging to Steel Mavetti, but he didn't receive the body as hard as steel, the tenacious vitality of being impervious to gunfire, flames, or a certain degree of explosive. The first is the power of a zombie, which allows me to unleash a critical attack, making up for my previous flaws of only having a nimble combat style. The second is mastery over ice. Although it's impossible to condense an ice spear or create a blizzard like that of the demoness pathway to inflict a direct attack, I can freeze the surrounding ground, lower the temperature of the air, and effectively affect the movement of my enemy. If there's any physical contact, then I can even freeze the enemy's body or stiffen his flesh and blood. It's a perfect match for my combat ability. The third is the manipulation of zombies. Heh, I no longer need to be afraid of not being able to have partners for a round of cards, Klein thought for a moment. Then he bent down to inspect the items on Steel Mavetti's person. He quickly found 26 pounds, 11 soldi and 8 pence in cash, as well as a collection of strange things that seemed normal, such as candles, clips, a thorny whip, and so on. Considering the fact that Steel Mavetti was a member of the Rose School of Thought and belonged to the type of people who indulged in their desires, Klein vaguely understood what was going on. Spitting on the ground, he only took the cash. Werewolf has supernatural healing power. Zombie has a body like steel. There's really no need for him to carry any healing-related medicine or items. It's as Danitz concluded, Mavetti doesn't have any mystical items. That's right, mystical items are few in number to begin with. Many have clear flaws and negative effects. Not everyone can have one even if they want one. Previously, in the group consisting of a wraith, zombie, and werewolf, there were only 2 mystical items, Scarlet Lunar Corona and Biological Poison Bottle. Klein nodded and took out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded the yellowed piece of paper and placed it on the body of Steel Mavetti, covering his face. It was a bounty notice with a portrait of Mavetti and the corresponding bounty reward, 6,000 pounds. Klein straightened up, took a step back, stepped on the peacock blue carpet and pulled out a paper figurine. Puh! With a swing of his arm, his wrist shook, and the paper figurine was thrown out. It burst into flames before scattering into ashes. Soon after, he phased into a shadow and disappeared into the alley along with the item. 2 or 3 minutes later, Cordoba Roy rushed over with a portion of the mandated Punisher team, just in time to see a cool breeze blow up the bounty notice, revealing steel Mavetti's dissolving flesh and blood dissolving, his eyes wide open. Whoosh! The bounty notice fell to the side and remained facing up. Having lost track of their target, Cordoba and the others silently brought Steele's corpse back to the area where the battle had taken place. Glancing at the team members who were inspecting the site, the deacon, Cordoba, restrained his emotions and asked in a deep voice, a believer of the sun. This was the most important question for him and his diocese. The mandated Punisher team member responsible for finding clues via supernatural means to recreate the truth wasn't a Beyonder of the Storm Pathway, but a Sequence 7 knowledge keeper corresponding to Reader, also known as Detective. He didn't rush to answer, but instead came over and squatted down to examine Mavetti's corpse. After a while, he looked up and said, "It's not a believer of the sun, probably a result of using the powers of a mystical item." "Reason?" Cordoba asked with a frown. The mandated Punisher said, "There's an evil feeling within that stems from flesh and blood. One of the corpses was devoured in such a manner, leaving only a body's traits and item. If it's a sun believer, they wouldn't do something like that even if they relied on item. To them, things in the domain of the true creator are sacrilegious and require immediate purification or sealing. They likely wouldn't borrow its powers." After thinking for a few seconds, Cordoba agreed with this conclusion and asked, "Someone from the Aurora Order?" "No, a real Rose Bishop or Shepherd wouldn't act so crudely. They'll definitely wrap the corpse within their body and deal with the scene after departing. There's no reason to dismember the body on the spot. It's a waste of time that also leaves a bunch of items that can be considered valuable. To devour him in such a rush, it resembles that of the negative effects of a mystical item," the knowledge keeper said calmly. "A mystical item that possesses powers in both the sun and secret suppliant domain. Perhaps it's something with powers like that of a shepherd." "Berg, what's your take?" As a deacon, Cordoba had the clearance to know of a shepherd and their special ability. As for the knowledge keeper knowing, it was a result of his position in the team. The other mandated Punishers had no idea what they were talking about. Knowledge keeper Berg stood up. "TT's all possible." "Any suspects?" Cordoba asked in a low voice. Berg shook his head. "There are no suspects for the time being. But one thing can be confirmed. Lud Brambles was killed by blazing Danitz. The other person is his helper, a rather terrifying powerhouse that's not weaker than a pirate admiral." A terrifying powerhouse. Cordoba's expression turned grave as he muttered under his breath. Following that, his eyes lit up. "Could it be Edwina? She can simulate some Beyonder powers which she has seen before." Knowledge keeper Berg pondered for a moment and then said, "We can't rule out that possibility, but our intelligence shows that she was in the vicinity of Sonya Island a few days ago. Unless she can simulate a corresponding ability and use the spirit world to travel here." Cordoba paced back and forth, looked around and said, "Deal with the scene and don't bring this to the attention of the nearby residents. TLL, submit the mission report, and let's hope that we'll receive more effective information." This involved a powerhouse whose combat prowess was equivalent to at least a Sequence 5. He could only restrain his irascible mood and make the most rational decision. Inside Old Quinn's house, in the basement with the heavy stone door sealed shut, Alger was sitting on the low bed, quietly looking at the candles on the table when his vision blurred. He saw the gray fog emanate, along with the fool sitting on a high chair overlooking everything. A blurry silhouette appeared below, hands clasped before his face as he said in a pious tone, "Honorable Mr. Fool, the matter has come to a successful conclusion. The matter has come to a successful conclusion. This involves Steel Mavetti and several other Beyonders. The world sure is efficient at handling matter. His strength is stronger than I expected. As expected of an adorer of Mr. Fool, he might be able to sell another Beyonder characteristic at the Tarot Club, maybe even more than one. How did he get around the effects of sealed artifact 237? The uniqueness of a god's adorer." A thought flashed through Alger's mind, and he instinctively thanked Mr. Fool. Then he took out a small metal bottle and smeared mint extract on the tip of his nose. A strong, irritating odor seeped into his head, instantly making Alger become abnormally clear-headed. At some point in time, a white gauze mask appeared in his hands, and he had poured the full moon essence oil onto it. After methodically putting on his mask, Alger stood up and walked slowly to the heavy stone door. With a staid series of movements, He retrieved a sealed metal jar from the inside of his clothes, twisted the mechanical switch, and pulled out a tube. Then he stuffed the tube into the crevice of the stone door and extended it out. Without a sound, the gas inside the metal container started to emanate. This was the sanguine anesthetic gas provided by the moon, Emlyn. It can knock out strong commoners, sequence 9 Bayonders with strong bodies, and even higher sequences who were lacking in their constitution. Even if Old Quinn can resist the gas, he would still be significantly affected. As for his helpers and friends, Alger leaned against the stone door and waited patiently. When nearly a third of the gas was dispersed from the jar, he pulled the tube back and closed the switch. He turned around and listened attentively before receiving a satisfactory answer. Alger revealed a faint smile. He rapidly converged his aura and compressed it inside him. Suddenly, the muscles on his body bulged, and he threw a punch forward. Raging blow. Bang! The iron lock of the heavy stone door directly shattered, and the door itself opened up. Alger withdrew his fist and walked out, leaving only the sleeping figures outside. Author's note: creeping hunger has two modes, grazing and devouring. Former targets the soul and Bayonder characteristic, while the latter targets the flesh and blood. 48 Acid Lemon Street, outside the Wind of Azure Inn. Dressed in a thick jacket and pantaloons, Blazing Danitz returned by taking a detour. He clung to the corner of a wall, remaining motionless for a long time. He was hesitating on whether to take the opportunity to run away and not face the terrifying madman, Jayaman Sparrow, again. Unlike the battle at Banzi Harbor, he was hiding on a rooftop far away this time. It allowed him to take in the entire battle zone. Therefore, while supporting Jayaman Sparrow and battling Blood Brambles Hendry, he finally saw the combat process of the crazy adventurer, finally grasping his Bayonder powers and traits. Paper figurine substitutes, phasing out from flames, psychic blasts, a holy beam from the sun domain, shooting out air bullets with his finger, the ability to disguise himself into another person, as well as a glove that changes its appearance several times in Devoured Squall. His powers far exceed my imagination, and there are few that can't be compatible with each other. This isn't something that can be explained simply with the addition of one or two miraculous items to a sequence. Also, the sense of hunger that came from the depths of his soul explains something. That glove from the Vice Admiral Hurricane, creeping hunger. Captain had specifically reminded us that the glove can use the souls of many Bayonders for grazing and thus use their powers. Danitz went through the thoughts he previously had and came to a final judgment. Jayaman Sparrow is the current owner of Creeping Hunger. He didn't feel any sense of belittlement simply because Jayaman had relied on a powerful mystical item to display such terrifying strength. Instead, he felt even more reverence for him. The reason for this was just one. A large part of using a mystical item to its fullest had to do with one's ability. Without sufficient strength and extraordinary combat experience, even with Creeping Hunger, Jayaman Sparrow wouldn't have been able to finish off Steel Mavetti and Calm Squall within 10 seconds. 2. His captain, Vice Admiral Edwina Edwards, learned from secret sources that Vice Admiral Hurricane didn't die at the hands of the Church of Storms, but instead, he was quickly killed by a particular powerhouse while fleeing. Danitz had no lack of understanding regarding the power of Vice Admiral Hurricane, Kalangos, back when he was at his peak. He knew that the standing of a powerhouse which could easily finish him off was equal to that of the top pirate power. Furthermore, it would be two of the most powerful and terrifying ones, the King of the Five Seas and Queen Mystic. Although there's the factor of surprise, it would just lower the evaluation by a little. The person wouldn't be much weaker than the King of Immortality, and they'll be stronger than Admiral Hell and Admiral of Blood. Creeping Hunger now belongs to Jayaman Sparrow. This means that he's either the one who killed Kalangos, or there's a power figure at the level of the four kings backing him up. No matter which possibility it is, it's all the more terrifying than I had originally expected. Danitz's body tensed up. He really didn't want to face the adventurer who had crazy blood flowing in it. Phew, he heaved a sigh of relief. He felt that he had been hesitating here for too long, and that he had to make a decision as soon as possible. Jayaman Sparrow knows how to divine, and he's rather confident in his abilities in this domain. With my shadow cloak in his hands, escaping won't only fail, but it would also end up infuriating him. Shadow cloak is a rare mystical item. Clenching his teeth, Danitz turned the corner and went through the door of the hotel, all the way to the luxurious suite. After a few seconds of careful waiting and observation, Danitz took out his key and opened the door. He saw that the room was dark, that the gas wall lights hadn't been lit, and that the not very bright light of the early morning was shining through the window and onto J.M. and Sparrow, who was facing the door. The adventurer had changed back into his usual tweed black overcoat with dark trousers. He held a half-top hat in his hand, and his right foot was raised over his left thigh. He leaned back a little, his face obscured since his back was to the window. Only his dark brown eyes, which were exceptionally clear, watched the door with indifference and calmness. Danitz unconsciously lowered his head, laughed dryly, and said, "In accordance with your instructions, I circled to a few news agencies and wrote the information that Blazing had killed Steele Mavetti, Blood Brambles Hendry, and Squall on pieces of paper and threw them in. Of course, I mentioned having a powerful helper in this piece of news. He's a mysterious, unknown, a top adventurer and a veteran bounty hunter." Klein nodded, revealing a polite smile. "Very good." With a sigh of relief, Danitz looked around and saw the peacock blue carpet. He was stunned for a few seconds before asking in puzzlement, "What about the heads of Steele and Hendry?" Klein replied calmly, "Wasn't taken." "You didn't take them?" Danitz exclaimed in astonishment. "Then what about our bounty?" As long as they had the heads of Steele and Blood Brambles, he would be able to get the appropriate bounty through people with connection. Although this would cost them 15 to 30% of the money received, he couldn't claim the bounty himself as a pirate. This was the only way, as the military's and the church's use of bounty rewards to encourage pirates to kill each other didn't mean that they would turn a blind eye to a gift that came walking through the door. To Danitz's surprise, J.M. and Sparrow, whose eyes were crazed with the desire for money, had actually not taken the heads of Steele and Blood Brambles, which meant that he had automatically given up on the bounty. Klein didn't answer him and pointed to the flying carpet on the ground. "You had helped in this. You have two choices. One is 3,000 pounds in cash, and the other is this flying carpet. You have 5 seconds to consider. Exceeding that time will be considered as forfeiting. 3,000 pounds in cash or the flying carpet." This flying carpet seems to only have the ability of suspension and flight. Furthermore, its speed isn't too fast, and it's not too useful at sea, to a beyonder not from the sailor pathway. Such items are very precious. At the very least, there's no need to worry about the aftermath of a ship being sunk. Danitz was momentarily thrown into a dilemma. Then he heard J.M. and Sparrow's voice counting. So Danitz's heart skipped a beat and he quickly said, "Flying carpet." Klein nodded and said, "Okay." With the knowledge that J.M. had great credibility, Danitz finally relaxed before asking with a grumbling mumble, "Why didn't you count 5 and 4? Wasn't it supposed to be 5 seconds?" Klein replied without changing his expression, "Counted inwardly." Counted inwardly, Danitz took a deep breath and grimaced. Klein slowly stood up, flicked his wrist, threw the hat from his hand, and left it hanging firmly on the rack before walking to his bedroom. Cathedral of Waves. Alger, who entered in the name of coming for morning prayers, met the diocese bishop, Chogo, and explained everything that had happened last night. The only thing that had been modified was that the sanguine anesthesia gas had been turned into a slumber charm of the Church of Evernight. Chogo nodded in approval. To be able to go deep into the enemy's lair and bear the risk of death for the sake of your faith, such an act is worthy of praise. You are a true storm attendant. Last night we captured 5 beyonders and killed 2 of them on the spot. As a result of this, Mavetti, Hendry, and Squall have also died. The heads of these 3 pirates will no longer appear, or they will be in our hands, so the government's bounty will be ours. The total receivable reward will exceed more than 10,000 pounds in total, and you will receive the bulk of it, which is 6,000 pounds. Do not refuse. The Lord has told us that those who fight for their faith must not be reserved. Holy Lord of Storms. An excited Alger pounded his left chest with his fist. Although he and the world didn't agree on how to split the spoils of war, he believed that the 2 of them had come to a tacit understanding. For example, they were not to interfere with each other when hunting pirates. As the bounty needed to be laundered through the church, the 2 of them would split it equally. As for the bounty offered by countries and organizations such as Intis and FASAC, Alger didn't hold any expectations for them. This was because every time one exchanged for the bounty reward, one needed to hand over the corpse or head of the target. Therefore, only one entity could be chosen. Only those with a deep background and good relations with the various organizations and countries could receive all of them. 3,000 pounds will belong to the world. If I were to lose 3,000 pounds at once, it will raise suspicion. Yes, I'll have to find an opportunity to buy a mystical item. Such things are rare, so they're often overpriced, even more so when in times of great need. No one will doubt that I spent 5,000 pounds on a purchase that's worth 3,000 pounds. If I sell the items obtained from Old Quinn, the ones he had received, the accounts would be squared. Alger quickly came up with a follow-up solution. Knowing that he had 3,000 pounds waiting for him, Klein sat happily in the high-backed chair of the fool and considered a serious question. That is, after grazing steel Mavetti, he had to release a soul from creeping hunger as he promised. Their Beyonder powers are quite useful. It's quite a pity to release them before finding a replacement. Yes, besides, I've already released that faceless. There doesn't seem to be a need to do it this time. Feelings of hesitation and reluctance to part had stirred in Klein's heart as he was thrown into a dilemma. He was unable to make a decision. After a long time, he leaned back and exhaled. I can't deceive myself. He shook his head and laughed, turning relaxed from making up his mind. He decided to keep his promise and release a soul. Faceless from before had been released early because he wanted to receive some corresponding information. It was already an equal exchange. Which one should I release? Miss Justice bought the materials for a psychiatrist's potion and a mystical item worth 5,500. Even if she's rich, her financial situation should be tight, so it wouldn't be appropriate to sell the psychiatrist characteristic at this time. Yes, she still owes my adorer 2,000 pounds and will repay the money in February or March. Klein rejected the idea and decided to release the nightmare. As a former Nighthawk, he always had an inclination and felt gratitude based on his impression and feelings towards Beyonders in this domain. Therefore, it wasn't difficult to make a choice in these situations without having any other factors to consider. Calming himself down, Klein picked up the human-skinned glove that he had previously brought above the gray fog. He closed his eyes and began to sense the distorted soul. Without any hesitation, he released the nightmare. The nightmare appeared by the side of the long bronze table. He was a man in his 30s with black hair and blue eyes, a long, thin face, and obvious nasolabial fold. He had a beard that wasn't too thick by his mouth and chin. As the pain and the distortion eased, he pressed his hand to his chest and gave a solemn bow. Compared to the faceless from before, the nightmare was obviously not as muddle-headed and weak after being released. It was unknown if the Evernight pathway's enhancement to one's soul was stronger than that of the seer pathway, or if it was because the grazing process had only happened recently. Klein sighed silently and began asking via spirit channeling, "Why did you die at the hands of Kalango?" The corner of the nightmare's mouth slightly curled up, revealing a bitter smile. Team, a red glove from the Nighthawks. I was tracking down a bunch of ancient chronicles that originated from a Baalem imperial tomb. We suspected that they were related to the reason for Death's passing. He found out that a part of it might have fallen into the hands of a particular tycoon, so I led 2 companions of mine and boarded the ship he was on. Unfortunately, we were attacked by Kalangos' fleet just as we were about to launch an investigation. What happened to your companions? Klein subconsciously asked. The nightmare said in a slightly pained tone, "We originally had the opportunity to leave and even kill Kalangos through our skillful teamwork, but our ship sank, and we had to board a lifeboat instead. Everyone died, no, they were killed in the line of duty." May the goddess bless you, Klein drew a crimson moon inwardly. This made him more aware of the great difference between fighting at sea and fighting on land. Environmental factors were of critical importance. Beyonders not from the sailor pathway would be at a great disadvantage. If it wasn't because of the fact that the flying carpet had been huge, cumbersome, and slow, making him an easy target, Klein would have opted to keep it and give Dan its cash. Fortunately, I have the bladder of a Murloc. I can find an artisan to create a mystical item that allows me to swim underwater. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to find an artisan. Most of them are from the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery, and there aren't many unaffiliated ones. Otherwise, mystical items wouldn't be this rare. If push comes to shove, I'll get Mr. Hanged Man to help. Klein looked at the nightmare who had been killed in the line of duty and said softly as he leaned back, "What's your name? What unfulfilled wishes do you have?" The figure of the nightmare was already slowly dissipating. When he heard Klein's question, he said with a smile, "My name is Davy Raymond. I lost my parents, wife, and siblings in a black magic incident, leaving me with only one daughter, Nilu. She was born in 1330 and is a very lovely girl. And I'm sorry to say that in order to investigate the truth over the black magic incident, I joined the Nighthawks and later became a Red Glove. I didn't manage to spend time with her, making her lose her father alongside her mother. Heh heh, I believe that the church will definitely give her my pension and secretly provide her a certain amount of help. I'm not worried about her life, but I only hope to see her enter the hall of marriage under the witness of the goddess, to have her own family and not be lonely anymore. TT's already the year 1350. She may already have a marriage partner, Klein sighed wistfully and said. Time flies, Davy Raymond muttered in response. Tell her that all the culprits have been punished and that I died because of an accident. There's no need to hate anyone anymore. Tell her that Daddy loves her and Daddy is very sorry. His figure became more and more transparent and he was about to disappear. Klein closed his eyes and asked, where does she live? What's the name of the tycoon who collected Death's Chronicles? We live in Daisy County's Canant City. It's a beautiful seaside city, with rich rubber plantations growing nearby. If she hasn't moved, then she'll be living at 67 Red Indus Street. The tycoon's name is Jimmy Necker. He should have fallen into the hands of Kalangos as well. Before Davy Raymond finished speaking, his figure had already completely disappeared, leaving only a deep black gem-like object on the surface of his glove. Klein quietly watched this scene, and after a few seconds he raised his right hand and tapped 4 times clockwise on his chest. He then said in a deep voice, if there's a chance, I will visit your daughter and see how she's doing. In the palace, which looked like a giant's residence, the fog was endless, without any undulations, and was eternally unchanging. Klein put away Davy Raymond's Beyonder characteristic, rubbed his forehead, and turned his attention back to Death's Chronicles. The Death pathway and the Evernight pathway can be switched at high sequences. There's nothing odd about the church sending personnel to investigate the corresponding chronicles. I wonder if Jimmy Necker is dead or not. I'll need to find out if he has already perished in a tragic case, and the thing has fallen in Kalangos' hands. That will require me to investigate from the pirates' side. Kalangos' crew now belongs to Vice Admiral Aylment Tracy. As it involves death, it might be able to help Mr. Azek. Klein decided to check it out in passing himself, and if he encountered any difficulties, he could write directly to the powerhouse. After clearing his mind, he quickly returned to the real world and used the ritual to summon Creeping Hunger back. After everything was done, and seeing that it was already getting late, he gave up on the idea of trying to catch up on his sleep. He decided to summarize the experiences and lesson from last night's operation. The biggest lesson for Klein was that he had overestimated the patience of the mandated Punisher. He had originally hoped that, even if there had been an accident in the beginning, the mandated Punishers would have been able to restrain him and wait for the real target, the real protagonist, Steel Maveti, to appear. When that happened, they would have definitely used the sealed artifact which can pull many people into a dream, restraining all the unaffiliated Beyonders who had involved themselves in the Blitz. As for me, due to my uniqueness, I would be able to detect that I'm asleep and be able to forcibly escape. Then I could have dealt with Steel Maveti and his helpers in a composed manner, completing an achievement of an instant kill, and also bring 2 corpses along with me. Yet, just as the incident happened, that bunch of irascible bros stormed in. They didn't even leave any backup teams to watch out for any contingency. At the very most, they would let the wielder of the sealed artifact stay beyond the periphery, with 1 or 2 guards. The more Klein thought, the more he was at a loss on whether to laugh or cry. If it wasn't because Steel mandated Punisher's group of pirates who were more cautious and had at least 2 Beyonders assigned, as well as all their puppets and zombies to stop the mandated Punishers that might have pursued them, Klein would likely have found himself in a situation of going 2 against 5. If that had happened, he would have chosen to give up and directly engage in a strategic shift. What made Klein most satisfied was that he had done a pretty good job of making specific preparation. This was the professional habit of a magician. Because he had long known from Miss Sharon and Marek about the traits of the first 5 sequences of the mutant pathway, Klein was well aware that Steel Maveti, who had gone through the lunatic phase, could use irrational factors to resist any Beyonder disruption and influence on his mind. He had very strong resistance in this aspect. Therefore, he gave up the thought of using Psychiatrist's Dragon Might and Frenzy, as well as Nightmare, which was clearly weaker than the mandated Punisher's sealed artifact, and he instead focused on the interrogator's psychic piercing and the Priest of Light's purification power. Psychic piercing wasn't a beyonder power that disrupted one's thoughts and affected one's soul, but a means to directly attack the spirit body. In essence, the other effect acted on one's body of heart and mind, and targeted the soul body. There was a clear difference between the two. If any part of that combo failed to chain in any way, Steel Mavetti would have been able to recover, making it impossible for me to kill him quickly. And in that environment, that would spell failure. Yes, I've also used the pathway's trait of losing themselves to their desires, making it easy to grasp their emotion. I believed that once they suffered a psychic attack, there would be a high chance of them counterattacking in madness, without any consideration of anything else. In fact, the safest way of dealing with a zombie is to set up matchsticks or have Danet. I'll use Flaming Jump and Light of Holiness, kiting Mavetti. It'll make him want to battle, but be completely unable to reach his opponent. He wouldn't escape even if he wanted to. Just send a fireball and it'll catch up to him. Unfortunately, it's a waste of time and the situation didn't allow for it. Klein sighed, took out his pocket watch, snapped it open and checked the time. Seeing that it was almost 9 o'clock in the morning, he turned the handle of the door and walked out of the bedroom. At this moment, Danitz was lying in a reclining chair, producing snores that sounded like a steam engine was operating in the room. He was quite alert, opening his eyes and sitting up as soon as Klein came out. "Are you going out?" Danitz asked when he saw Jamin Sparrow take off his hat from the coat rack. "Yes." Klein maintained his persona and didn't explain that he was attempting to act by helping someone confess. "What about me? Steel Mavetti and his men are almost all dead, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. Even if the newspaper doesn't publish the news, I can spread it myself. There were idle pirates and adventurers who will use it as a material for bragging, spreading the matter to the sea, and would end up informing Captain. That bunch of dogshit can't do a thing aside from drink and brag, but even so they still have their uses." Danitz thought for a moment. Then he asked while secretly feeling a sense of fear, "Mr. Sparrow, can I leave now?" Klein revealed a faint smile. "You have always been free." "That's right, I wasn't caught by him this time. I was just looking for help. I have always been free." Danitz was stunned for a moment, then he was delighted. But right at that moment, he heard Jamin Sparrow's voice lightly fleeting towards him. "But that ends now." What?" Danitz looked confused. It took him no less than 3 seconds to understand what Jamin Sparrow meant. He had been captured again. "Why?" Danitz asked angrily and agreed. Klein put on his hat and said in a low voice, "I want to meet your captain." Danitz widened his eyes, stood up abruptly and shouted out, "What do you want?" "This fellow is a little too agitated," Klein replied calmly. "I have some things to ask her." "He has some things to ask, Captain." Danitz frowned as he watched Jamin Sparrow leave the room, unsure what his real motive was. What is this fellow really after? Money, riches. But he had the time to take away the heads of Steel Mavetti and Blood Bramble's Hendry to exchange for nearly £10,000 in bounty rewards. Yes, even after paying any commissions, it would still be £7,000 to £8,000. Yet he didn't do so. Moreover, he generously shared the spoils of war with me. This is very contradictory. When he first heard that I was blazing, his first reaction was to call me a £3,000 bounty. In Captain's words, "This isn't scientific. Why would he deliberately give up the bounty? Unless he has a better way to claim it safely, or he had specially left it for someone." Yes, he had been prepared for the appearance of the mandated punishers. He has his own connections and information channel. This way, everything can be explained. There's also the possible existence of the demigod that killed Kalanga. There's a powerful and secretive organization behind Jamin Sparrow. Shocked by his own conjecture, Danitz instinctively tried to use his body language to express his feelings, but he forgot that his left arm was still fractured. He immediately grimaced in pain. This made him feel even more terrified. He didn't want his captain to meet such a dangerous and crazy fellow. He even suspected that Jamin Sparrow's real motive was his captain's £26,000 bounty. In a duel, that lunatic might not necessarily win against Captain, and there's still the first mate, second mate, third mate, and a few bosun. But he has a terrifying organization backing him. "You want to hurt Captain? Over my dead body." Danitz puffed out his chest, raised his neck, and was filled with a stirring sense of self-sacrifice. He ran a hand through his hair, gave a long grunt, and said to himself, "I'll make further observation. Perhaps J.M. Sparrow really only has questions that he wants answered." Subconsciously, he looked around and found both the flying carpet and the shadow cloak. They weren't missing. In other words, J.M. Sparrow left the things that belonged to me behind. Isn't he afraid that I'll take the opportunity to escape? Or did he steal my hair that makes it easy for divination? No, he's a crazy guy. Even if he wishes to use my hair, he would just walk over and extend his hand to pull one out. It's impossible for him to do it secretly, right? There's a powerful and secretive organization behind him. Perhaps at this moment, there are people from that organization secretly monitoring me. They're waiting for me to leave, waiting for me to seek out Captain. How insidious. J.M. Sparrow must have gone out on purpose. Danitz felt that he had grasped the truth of the matter, thanks to his experience and wisdom. He paced back and forth before sitting back in the reclining chair. He then thought with a silent, mocking smile, "I'm not leaving. I want to see what you can do. I will not bring danger to Captain." 3:15 in the afternoon, Saimim Island. This island was also a part of the Rorstad archipelago, but it was the furthest from the city of Generosity Bay. It took nearly 5 hours on a liner to reach it. On the way, Klein bought a suit with local characteristics and a small suitcase to replace the clothes he changed out of, for a total of 14 soldi. They weren't even worth £1. It's really cheap. It's just change compared to a complete suit. Wearing pantaloons, a thick brown jacket, and a light brown cap, Klein disembarked from the liner with a native face that didn't stand out, and he entered some of the old ports on Saimim Island. He had spent time buying clothes and changing his appearance, causing him to miss the 9 o'clock ferry and be put in a situation where he could only take the ferry at 10. Thinking of the expenses he had to pay for this acting, he couldn't help but calculate his current financial situation. The faceless characteristic was sold for £3,825. The pirate bounties net me £3,000. Although I haven't received the £6,825, I can basically include it into my budget as long as Mr. Hanged Man doesn't get exposed. The leftover cash from Donna and Company's gratuity add up to £255 in bits and pieces. I found £26, 11 soldi, and 8 pence from Steel Maveti's body. Yes, there's still the 5 gold coins as reserves. I haven't spent much money recently, only spending slightly more than £1 in total. This is something to be happy about. With that, I'll have £7,110. Moreover, I still have the Nightmare Bay under characteristic and the Murloc's bladder. They're still worth something. On second thought, I earned a £3,000 bounty with a zombie bay under characteristic. The latter is worth about £3,000 to £5,000. That is to say, I earned about £7,000. This is only from Steel Maveti, Blood Brambles, Hendry, and Squall. Besides, there was quite a lot of waste. Indeed, hunting pirates is quite a good job. It can administer justice, punish the evil, protect the weak and innocent, and also make me rich overnight. Klein subconsciously turned his head to the side, only to see that the color of the seawater was much clearer than that of Bayam. It was as if the seawater was a huge, green, sparkling gem, reflecting golden rays under the sunlight. Sure enough, it's not without reason that generations after generations of adventurers have gone out to sea to search for wealth. Even if I deduct the remnant spirituality of ancient wraiths, eyes from a 6-winged gargoyle, spring water from Sonya Island's golden spring, and other supplementary ingredients of a nimble-right master, the money I have left will be enough to allow me to buy a decent manor here, in Daisy Bay, in the southern continent's colonies, and in the non-metropolitan areas. Lone's countryside is said to be very beautiful, and if it turns out that I'm really unable to return, I can consider settling down in a similar place. Yes, I still have a 10% stake in the Backland Bike Company, and my future returns won't be low. With confidence, Klein straightened his back and thought about the future. After letting his thoughts wander, Klein began to think about the more realistic question, which was whether he should sell the Nightmare Bay under characteristic, find an opportunity to return it to the Church of Evernight, or create a mystical item with it through an artisan. It depends on the situation. The ideal solution would be to sell it to the church. The martyr Klein, who had taken 2 potions from the Nighthawks, thought with uncertainty. At the same time, he hoped that Little Sun would soon reach Sequence 7 and be qualified to gain clearance to the methods used to remove the mental corruption from a Beyonder characteristic. As for the matter of releasing the Priest of Light from the glove, he wasn't in a hurry. Little Sun had just received the potion formula for Sequence 7, so he had no need for it at the moment. He would have to wait for a long time, and the powers of a Priest of Light was very effective in dealing with a pirate like Admiral of Blood in a way that was far more potent than the Sun Brooch. As his thoughts slowly settled down, Klein entered the small port town. The place was basically filled with natives. Their skin was nearly bronze, and their black hair had slight, natural curl. Their bodies emitted a scent that was derived from prolonged contact with spices. After changing his appearance and asking about Rain's situation, and if there was any news of Went's death, Klein found a secluded corner. He wiped his face with his hand, turning his face into a tall, thin Went with rather distinct facial features. He carried his suitcase and circled around the town to its border. It was then that he saw the winery run by Rain's family. The girl with flaxen-colored hair could no longer be called a young girl. She had obviously matured a lot compared to what Went remembered. She was sweeping the entrance, and there was no one around. Klein took a deep breath and slowly let it out, feeling as though he was placed in a very difficult position. As a powerful keyboard warrior, he knew about theories like method acting and experimental acting, but he lacked further understanding. He could only try to guess at Went's mood and performance in this kind of scenario. Finally, he closed his eyes and walked over. Rain looked up when she heard footsteps, finally identifying the visitor. She opened her mouth slightly and let out a half-surprised exclamation before saying with a straight face, "Why are you suddenly back?" "Remember, you're just acting," Klein revealed a smile. "T came to bid you farewell." He spoke in a local dialect, with a somewhat nondescript Bayam accent. The language of the Rorstad archipelago was also derived from ancient Fasak and belonged to another variant. As a half-historian, Klein was able to master it easily, and it only took him a short time to master it. "Farewell?" Rain asked, slightly surprised. Klein turned his head, looked to the side, and smiled. "Team going to chase after a treasure trove, and I don't know when it'll be able to come back. When the time comes, I'll appear with a great deal of money. I'll buy a manor in the suburbs, plant some rubber trees, set up a vineyard, have my own mill, wine cellar, blacksmith shop, and let the air be filled with the scent of all kinds of spices. Then I'll buy a few slaves and hire some servants, just like those masters. But I'll still be short of one thing." He overcame his goosebumps that were about to form on his skin, and he turned to look Rain in the eye. "I still lack a wife and a mistress for the manor. Rain, I like you. I wish to marry you. The reason I said it out loud today isn't to get an answer, but because I'm afraid that I would never have the chance to tell you again." After listening quietly, Rain suddenly scolded angrily, "Went, you're a coward." This reaction isn't right." Klein deliberately revealed a surprised expression. Rain suppressed her voice and said, 3 years ago, 3 freaking years ago, I was already prepared to head to Bayam with you. Yet you didn't say anything in the end. You coward. You chicken. What's the use of telling me now? You're going to see soon, and you may never come back." The more she spoke, the more agitated she became. "You've said it out loud and become happy. You have no regrets, but what about me? I'll have to constantly think about you returning and live on in pain. You selfish bastard." She waved the broom in her hand and swung it towards Went. Klein knew that the real Went would have hit the broom away, hugged the girl, and tell her that he wasn't going out to sea again, but he couldn't do the same. He had to pretend to be chased away pathetically, running all the way to a nearby alley. There, he hit his head against the wall while silently cursing himself. It was too f***ing awkward. This is too f***ing awkward. Rain went back to the door, picked up a broom, and crouched down. Her face was ashen. It was unknown what she was thinking about. Vaguely, she heard a sound, and she fell asleep. After using the charm, Klein turned around and nudged Rain, who was sitting on the ground while leaning against the wall. Then he quickly left the area, hiding in the distance to peep at the results. Rain quickly woke up and realized that she had fallen asleep without knowing. Everything that had happened just now appeared like a dream. She remained sitting there, motionless, for quite a while. Suddenly, she lowered her head and let out a sharp curse that seemed to come from the depths of her throat. "Went, you selfish bastard." Sigh. Klein, who felt a tiny sensation of digesting his potion, sighed, changed his appearance, and left the place. He would have to spend the night on Saimim Island, as there were no liners headed for Bayam until the morning. After changing his face and turning into one of the two main streets, Klein went straight to the green mailbox and took out a letter he had prepared long ago from his pocket. This was a death notice he had forged as an imitation of an official police document. It was sent to the sergeant of the town of Samim Harbor. It was about the sudden death of the local resident, Went in Bayham. When deciding to do the acting, Klein had worked out a plan to keep things on track and not cause irreparable damage to the girl, Rain. His plan was to use the slumber charm to camouflage the real acting as a dream. This way, if Rain had no love for Went, he expected her to directly reject his confession. After hearing about the other party's death, she wouldn't feel any guilt and at most some fear. In response to this, she could effectively be placated by going to church to pray and confess. If Rain also liked Went and responded to the confession, then the dream would give Klein a chance to extricate himself from the situation. The notification of Went's death would kill Rain's expectations, and it wouldn't have too negative an impact on her future life. But even so, it's still a bit cruel. No matter what kind of woman she is, facing the situation of a guy confessing to her in her dreams after his death is definitely going to be heartbreaking. She wouldn't be able to recover for a long time. Well, if I didn't do anything, and when the news of Went's death reaches her, Rain would definitely feel very sad even if it might not be that serious. However, that knot in her heart would never be able to be mended, and she would be stuck wondering for the rest of her life whether Went had gone out on an adventure to pursue his and her future, or if he simply didn't like her. It's not a bad way to end things like this. Once she has overcome her pain, she will carry that gentleness of having been truly loved once while leading her future life. Regardless, to forcibly interfere in the lives of others for acting, having an impact on an innocent person's life to a certain degree, even though I'm using the excuse of fulfilling a wish, it's not a truly kind thing to do. Just like Roselle said, the further one proceeds in the Beyonder pathway, the more twisted and evil it feels. The acting method might not be a catalyst. All I can do is try my best to minimize such effects. After sending the letter, Klein exhaled, and with a native face that didn't stand out, he walked to the only inn in town. Along the way, he summed up his previous experience, which was that disguising yourself as someone else and obtaining feedback was likely a main clause of the faceless principles, second only to you can disguise yourself into anyone but you are ultimately yourself. If it were any other faceless, they would have blocked out information about Went's death for the sake of this role. They would have agreed to Rain's confession and spent 1 to 2 years in a relationship with her, marry her, and have children with her, and then, to not be bound by the various relationships in this identity, remember who they were and leave coldly. If there was no exposure during this process, the potion would mostly be digested, but I really can't do it. It's just completely against my conscience. I can only try to push the envelope, Klein sighed, inexplicably afraid. He shook his head and thought in a silent, self-deprecating manner. Beyonders not only have to constantly fight against threats and madness, but also fight against all kinds of evil thoughts, as well as the corruption that pulls one down and can cause one to fall if they aren't careful. Even so, at the end of the day, one might still be corrupted by the abyss, becoming a monster that one swears to get rid of. Suppressing his thoughts, Klein stepped into the inn and said to the boss behind the counter, "An ordinary room." The thin boss looked up and gave a glance, saying, "A valid ID certificate." "How can a face I just came up with have one?" Klein smiled in embarrassment. "T forgot to bring it." "Then you cannot stay here. This is the rule of our town." The boss once again lowered his head and calculated his income and expenditure for the day. Klein took out a solely note and pushed it over as if nothing had happened. The boss's eyes suddenly widened. No, put it away. I don't want to be locked up by the sergeant." Get out, you dirty bastard with no proof of identity." Klein was thrown out of the inn in shock, unable to believe that the omnipotent entity known as money had just lost its power. After a few seconds of silence, he turned into an empty alleyway, turning back into Jam and Sparrow with stark facial features. Klein returned to the inn, tapped on the counter, and said Lonese in a Backland accent, "A room." The boss looked up and immediately put down the things in his hand. He then stood up and nodded with a smile. Okay. Do you need a room with a view of the sea or something quieter?" He switched to a clumsy Lonese that had a thick accent that resembled that of the land of spices, with no further mention of identification. "This really is a pragmatic world," Klein silently lampooned and politely responded, "Quiet." Yes, immediately," the boss responded hurriedly. Then he called an attendant, took the keys, and led Klein personally to the second floor. "Sir, how many days will you be staying?" "It's one solely 5 pence a night." Just tonight, Klein couldn't stand the enthusiasm, so he answered succinctly. At the Wind of Azure Inn, his luxurious suite with Danitz was 5 solely a night. Without a doubt, the room the boss had chosen was clean and tidy, and there was no trace of the usual humidity in a harbor inn. Klein looked around and nodded in satisfaction. "Excellent." "It's my honor," the boss flattered with obvious fear. Klein put down his luggage, rested for a while, then he got up and went back down to the ground floor to settle his dinner. Beside the counter, tables were arranged messily on the first floor. There was a greasy layer on their surface, and a fireplace was burning in the corner, giving off light and heat. The Rorsted archipelago was slightly to the south, and the lowest temperatures in winter was only about 10 degrees C. However, for the locals, this was still cold enough that they needed a fire to warm them up. Klein randomly found a seat and sat down, ordering a local specialty of grilled meat and spiced mushroom soup, with the main dish being potato bread. While he was waiting, he swept his gaze over the customers inside the restaurant. His gaze then instinctively landed on a lady. This lady had a head of simple tied-up black hair and a pair of distinctive greenish-gray eyes. Her appearance was the type that one would never get sick of easily, and the more he looked at her, the more intrigued he became. She was obviously not a native, but she was wearing a man's shirt and a thick tan jacket. By her hand was a round-brimmed hat with a depression in the middle. This was one of the more common adventurer outfits out in the sea. At her table, the 3 other men were the same, and they clearly appeared to have been exposed to the elements. Klein had never hid his appreciation of beautiful ladies, but his attention wasn't drawn to her by her appearance. The sea had a strong sense of discrimination against female. Women who could achieve a certain status among adventurers and pirates were either very scheming, very powerful, or both. They were people that one needed to be cautious and wary about. Their boots have some fresh mud on them. Did they just come back from the forest? Heh, they really are adventurers. Klein made a preliminary judgment based on some clues. If these 4 adventurers came by ferry from Bayam, even if they had previously stepped on sewage or mud, the traces would have already dried up. Furthermore, as the town hadn't rained in the past 2 days overall, the roads were quite clean with only some dust. Eliminating the 2 possibilities, it could only be explained that they had returned from a trip to the woods on the outskirts of the town. Klein had heard that many adventurers went deep into the primitive forests of the colonial islands in search of abandoned, forgotten pagan temples or altars, which often contained gold and jewels of ancient worship, but were later buried for various reasons in a place that no one knew of. In the bars of the islands, there was no shortage of legend that someone had managed to make a fortune overnight on an adventure into the woods. There might be evil spirits lingering in those places. It would be better to hunt pirates, or for one to at least acquire the relevant information in advance. Klein retracted his eyes and concentrated on waiting for the food. The 7 churches classified the various gods believed by the colony's primitive faiths as evil spirits, but Klein believed that some of them were natural spirits. After a while, the specialty grilled meat was served. It had been sliced into many smaller pieces and strung onto a wooden stick. The surface was smeared with a reddish-brown sauce. The fragrance was rich and the color was alluring. It looks a little like the kebabs from my previous life. In Lone, they're usually roasted as huge chunks of meat. Only after the meat is roasted would the chef slice up the meat. The method used here makes the flavors infuse the meat better. Klein picked up the wooden stick and bit down on a piece of meat. He felt the meat's juice slightly overflow, and there was a hint of sweetness in the salty fragrance. "It's my type." He nodded in satisfaction. Klein enjoyed the meal and even tasted the local gurney sap, a special beverage, like lemonade with sugar and milk. He went back to his room. Because he had been hunting the night before, he hadn't slept at all. He washed up early, put out the fireplace, and got into bed. Sleeping too early meant one problem: he would wake up in the middle of the night to pee. Klein's dream was interrupted. He opened his eyes and slowly accumulated the courage to lift his quilt. In the middle of the night, Simeem was about 8-9 degrees C, and it was enough to make it feel sufficiently cold. After lying still for a while, Klein stretched out his arm and silently withdrew it. He contemplated for a few seconds before reaching out his hand again and picking up the sun brooch from his bedside table. Although it only provided the feeling of a hot summer on a spiritual level, and it didn't produce any actual heat, it could at least deceive himself into thinking that it wasn't cold. Klein got out of bed and headed for the washroom. He narrowed his eyes to ease the pressure on his lower abdomen. When he was done, he pulled up his pants and was about to wash his hands when his spiritual perception was triggered. Klein frowned slightly and looked up at the vent in the bathroom. Suddenly, something black and slippery dropped and hung there. It was a venomous snake extending its forked tongue. Klein was startled. He opened his mouth and shouted, "Bang!" The snake was miserably hit, and it split in half. What happened? Klein stared at it for a few seconds. Seeing no further movement, he walked out of the bathroom and pulled a gold coin from his pocket. There is danger in the inn. Klein softly chanted the divination statement, entered cogitation, and then flipped a gold coin. Clang! A faint but crisp sound echoed in the quiet room. The gold coin tumbled and fell, landing in Klein's palm. It was tails, indicating a negative response. No danger, with a frown. Klein looked around and pulled out a bottle of insect-repelling essential oil from his coat on the coat rack. He sprinkled a circle around him. Then he quickly took 4 steps counterclockwise, entering the gray fog to make a divination for confirmation. In about 10 seconds he received a revelation. There was still no danger. Returning to the real world, Klein shook his head, put the gold coin and bottle back, wore his coat, trousers, and boots before sitting at the edge of his bed, leaning back against the pillow as he placed great caution on this turn of events. He still remembered his seer principles, especially the one about divination is not all-powerful, so even if the answers he received indicated it was safe, he didn't dare to relax and return to his slumber. This isn't to say that he didn't believe in the gray fog's ability to shield him from interference, but rather that there were too many possibilities. His divination statement might not be accurate enough to cover them all, resulting in his misinterpretation. He already had a guess about what had just happened. It was that the 4 adventurers in the restaurant had indeed found the abandoned and forgotten ancient temple in the primitive forest on Saimim Island. They had obtained wealth or cultural relics, but they had also stirred the barely surviving evil spirits, causing them to be plagued by evil thoughts and curses. Time ticked by, and Klein suddenly felt a subtle spirituality fluctuation spread out from the room and quickly blend into the surrounding darkness. The hidden flow that he had barely sensed vanished, and the tranquility of the night returned. As expected, it's a result of Beyonder powers. It was solved just like that. I'll just wait a little longer. It would be dawn in an hour or 2 anyway. Even if there really is a problem, this place has a cathedral and a mandated punishers team. Klein half closed his eyes and began to engage in cogitation. Bayam Emrys Leaf Bar. Danitz, determined to hoodwink any monitoring, carried a cup of Lanty proof and drunkenly watched as the girls on the boxing ring danced a hot, sexy dance. Dogshit. It'd been so long since they've lost a single piece of clothing. He shouted with the other drunks. Then, ignoring whether they received any response, they laughed out loud, clinked glasses, and drank. Have you read the newspapers? A man who was fooling around in the bar late at night burped and said to his companion, "Did your brain get eaten by a donkey? Do you think that I can read those twisting and turning letters of the alphabet? Holy Lord of Storms, I'm only interested in this kind of twisting and turning." Halasa. His companion raised his glass and pointed at the dancers, laughing at what he thought was a humorous answer. The man who had spoken earlier smacked the back of his head. Steele is dead. He was killed by blazing. The nearby Danitz was stunned for a moment, then he sat up, turning his head slightly. He cleared his throat and took a sip of the liquor, acting as if nothing had happened, but he secretly inched closer to hear what the others had to say about the matter. The adventurer and part-time pirate who had brought him into the trade had once said that life at sea would have been meaningless without liquor, women, and boasting. Steel? What steel? Let me tell you, when I was young, I once defeated a steel pipe. Another drunkard interrupted. What did you do to the steel pipe? Should I say something like, "Whoa, yours sure is thin"? The first man to speak revealed a knowing smile. He didn't wait for a reply as he continued, "Steel Mavetti is dead. The second mate of Admiral of Blood is dead." The last half of his words came out in a low growl. It frightened one of the fellows who was already wavering to slip to the bottom of the table as he raved in horror. "It wasn't me, I didn't do it. Dogshit. A bar is always so chaotic. Hurry up and get to the point. I'm waiting for you to praise Lord Blazing." The disguised Danitz couldn't wait to smash the cup of alcohol in his hand at the group. The papers mentioned that it was jointly done by the Navy and the Church. Steele is dead, Blood Brambles is dead. Even calm squall is dead. John Smith and that bunch of assholes have been caught as well. A drunk who was still a little lucid came over and joined in on the conversation. No, no, no. That's not the truth. The man who raised the topic first shook his head with a smile. I have a friend working at the news agency. He told me that he has verifiable intel that cannot be published. The Navy and the church were only used. The true murderer is Blazing Danitz and a mysterious, experienced and powerful adventurer, a bounty hunter. Impossible. There's absolutely no way Blazing Danitz can defeat Steel. Even if it's a sneak attack, there's no way he can finish Steel. A few drinkers shared similar viewpoints. The crux is that powerful adventurer. I suspect he's an adventurer, nearing the rank of a pirate admiral. The man who had started the conversation emphasized. I've no idea how Danitz got to know that guy. Heck, he contributed in the matter. Apparently, Blood Brambles was finished off by him. Didn't you notice? Blazing's bounty has increased to 4,200 pounds. That's right. Really? Blazing sure isn't simple. What a fierce pirate, no, a great pirate. Great pirates. I really couldn't tell the last time I drank with him. Pewee? You son of a bitch, when did I ever drink with you? I don't even know you. Amidst the exclamations, Danitz thought in delight. 4,200 pounds. If those fellows were to know, they would definitely get up at night to wipe the deck in envy. Ha ha ha, I can now be said to be the strongest bosun on the Golden Dream. At this moment, Danitz wished he could fly back to the ship and drink and brag with fellows like Iron Skin and Barrel, telling them all about the thrilling events in Banzai Harbor, how he had defeated the fallen bishop, how he had cleverly escaped from the ambush of Steel and the others, how he had set up a trap to finish off all his enemies, and how he would never be able to play the card game of life ever again. Unfortunately, for the sake of Captain, I still have to continue to be the servant of J.M. and Sparrow. That madman sigh, I'm already a great 200-pound pirate, Danitz sighed, allowing himself to continue to be paralyzed by the alcohol. As the Storm Cathedral's bells rang, the orange sun rose in the sky. The surroundings were still so quiet that only the sound of water could be heard. Without encountering anything abnormal, Klein exhaled in relief and took off his clothes, returned to bed, and made up for his lack of sleep by sleeping for another 2 more hours. His considerable spirituality allowed him to wake up at the scheduled time of 8:30 a.m. He washed up slowly, changed his clothes, and went to the first floor to buy a loaf of bread with cooked chestnuts and a glass of gurney sap. He ate as he walked to the dock. Since he had already bought his return tickets for the 9 o'clock liner, Klein kept watch of the time and prepared to board the ship. At that moment, he saw the lady with the greenish-gray eyes, as well as the 3 male adventurers from her team. They were buying tickets at the ticket office. The liner is about to leave. They definitely wouldn't be able to make it in time for the 9 o'clock trip. I wonder what they obtained from the abandoned temple, but last night they attracted an existence similar to an evil spirit. Please don't let anything unexpected happen when they ride on the liner. Klein used his body to block the adventurer's line of sight, took out a gold coin, and made a divination. His revelation was that the later liner wouldn't be in danger. Klein hesitated for 2 seconds, looked at the passengers waiting for the 10 o'clock liner near the ticket office, rubbed his fingers together in silence, and lit the ticket in his palm. He went back to the ticket office as if nothing had happened and bought the 10 o'clock liner ticket for 4 solid. Then he went to the washroom at the docks, went above the gray fog and quickly divined his worry. He knew very well that if the results showed that there were great dangers, he wouldn't take the risk of boarding the ship. Instead, he would find a way to prevent the ship from sailing and destroy it, if necessary, to prevent any innocents from dying. If the revelation was the same as the divination from before, he would ride it normally while keeping a lookout for any accidents. In the end, he still received a negative answer. Klein was relieved and returned to the real world. He adjusted the position of the Murloc's bladder for quick access. If an accident really happened, this Bayonder ingredient would become quite important in the vast ocean. This Bayonder ingredient could also be used in a rudimentary, simple manner, just like the all-black eye which had been contaminated by the true creator. 10 o'clock sharp. Klein, in his J.M. and Sparrow appearance, picked up his suitcase, followed the adventurers, and boarded the liner. Along the way, he appeared to doze off or read old newspapers and magazines on the ship, but in actual fact, he was keeping an eye on the greenish-gray-eyed lady and her companion. This wariness continued all the way to the port of Bayam, but no accidents occurred in the middle. Did they resolve all the problems? What did they actually get? Klein stopped by the side of the road, bought the latest newspaper from a newsboy, and watched the four adventurers from the corner of his eye until they disappeared. Phew, Klein decided to not think about it anymore. As long as it didn't endanger the overall situation, he wasn't concerned about what those people had done. He was just a little curious. He picked up his suitcase, leafing through the papers as he walked down Acid Lemon Street like an ordinary passerby. Suddenly, with a chuckle, he said to himself, "The bounty for Danitz has risen to £4,200. If things continued like this, he suspected whether he could resist the urge of sending the fellow to the Governor General's office." Walking back to the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein heard undulated snores that were slowly reaching a crescendo before he even took out his key. He didn't escape. Klein was slightly surprised, but he wasn't too surprised either. He had previously tampered with Shadow Cloak, so as long as Danitz left, he could use divination methods to track him down and find the Vice Admiral Iceberg. Although he's timid, he's still cautious. Klein opened the door and entered, looking at Danitz, who awoke with a start. He grinned a little. "Congratulations, Mr. £4,200. Danitz was instantly wide awake, wanting to laugh dryly in response, but he couldn't. At this moment, he felt that his life might be in danger. Danitz's worries didn't come true. Klein gave him a look and went into the bedroom to rest. During the 5 hours he spent on the liner, he had always been in a highly tense state. He had also been alarmed last night and didn't sleep well as a result. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel exhausted. With a thud, Klein closed the bedroom door. "Phew, he scared me to death." Danitz relaxed and slumped into the reclining chair. The scene of him turning into gold pounds had surfaced in his mind a moment ago. He found it difficult to stop having these scenes appear one after another in his mind. After a moment of silence, Danitz, who had been hanging around the bar until dawn, fell asleep again without realizing. He dreamed that the captain had arrived to save him, but she had failed. Instead, she got caught by Jam and Sparrow, and ended up becoming a maidservant for this crazy adventurer. Just as Danitz was outraged and unable to resist, he suddenly saw the blurry scene around him turn clear just as he was about to wake up. The scene froze on the luxurious suite of the Wind of Azure Inn. Knock, knock, knock. Danitz heard a slow, soothing knock on the door. Wasn't I dreaming? With this question in mind, Danitz walked over to the door and turned the handle. As the crack in the door widened, he saw a familiar figure. She was a beautiful lady, with a face shaped like a goose egg, a high nose bridge, thin lips, and a pair of pale blue eyes that resembled clear spring water. Her long brown hair parted in the middle, tied in a simple but delicate knot at the back of her head as they flowed down. She didn't wear a hat, only wearing a beige coat which was tight at the waist. Her collar was covered with palm-sized flowers woven from white lace. Matching her coat was a dark-colored skirt which reached her knee. The pleats of her skirt were connected, looking slightly fluffy. On her feet were a pair of leather boots that shared the same color as her hair. "Captain!" Danitz cried out in alarm. He hurriedly snapped out of his reverie, turned around and faced Jam and Sparrow's bedroom while taking a defensive stance. "Be careful. Run. A lunatic is looking for you. He has a terrifying organization backing him." As the feeling of self-sacrifice welled up in him, Danitz heard his captain calmly say, "This is a dream." "Dream? Yeah, I'm dreaming. What's there to be afraid of?" Danitz glanced left and right, folded his arms, turned around and said, "Captain, you simulated the powers of a nightmare. That can't be right. You were near Sanya Island just last week. The largest island in this region of the Sanya Sea, which was also the origin of its name. It was almost like a small continent. Originally, it was the only remaining gathering place for the elves after the cataclysm, but as time passed, this ancient Beyonder race was plagued by all sorts of factors and gradually died out. The occasional sighting of them proved that they hadn't completely gone extinct. At the end of the Fourth Epoch, the Lone Kingdom occupied this island, but in the 20-year war, they suffered a terrible defeat, handing over Sanya Island to the Fasek Empire. That was already more than 7 centuries ago. Sanya Island was situated northwest of the Rorsted Archipelago, and it took nearly half a month by ship to arrive there. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards was still in the vicinity of Sanya Island last week, so it was impossible to reach Bayam within a week, unless she could fly or use the spirit world to travel. The beautiful lady whom Danitz addressed as Captain nodded. We have just entered the Rorsted Seas, still 1,000 nautical miles away from Bayam. In other words, she'll take another 3 to 4 days before arriving. That's what I call normal, Danitz curiously asked. This should have already surpassed the range of a nightmare. Moreover, it far exceeds, he added inwardly. Vice Admiral Iceberg, Edwina, entered the room and walked towards the table and chair. TT's not a nightmare power, but a secret ritualistic magic. It uses an item left behind on the ship to enter the dream of someone very far away. Listening to the captain's meticulous explanation, Danitz instantly felt as if he had returned to the Golden Dream and was beginning his lesson. I've never heard of such ritualistic magic before. Yes, Captain has mastered many strange and rare magic and witchcraft. No one can tell how much knowledge she possesses. She seems to have mentioned that her sequence name is Mysticism Magister. Sigh, if I had known that she had this secret technique, then I wouldn't have been so frustrated over how to inform her about the unexpected events in Bayam. Danitz interrupted Edwina's description with a flurry of thoughts. Captain, you sense that there's a problem with our point of contact over here. Yes, this is another secret technique. Edwina seemed inclined to describe the specific method in detail. Seeing this, Danitz hurriedly sighed. Poor old Rin and the others. Edwina stopped walking and turned her back to the window, asking succinctly, what happened? TL have to start from Damir Harbor. Danitz felt energized, as if his long-lasting depression had finally paid off at that moment. He described his attempts to recruit Jam and Sparrow, but he ended up discovering that he was a madman, and he also exaggerated his plight on the White Agate. According to the rough draft he had prepared last night, he thoroughly described the weird and horrifying situation at Banzi Harbor, including the ambush and assassination attempt involving Steel Mavetti. He explained everything about how he joined forces with J.M. and Sparrow for a counterattack and hunt, as well as his own theories about J.M. and Sparrow's background and power. This included creeping hunger and the secretive, powerful organization. During this process, he tried his best to restore the truth, only exaggerating the role he played, raising his status from servant or attendant to an assistant or collaborator. Vice Admiral Edwina listened quietly the entire time, without interrupting him. When he was done, she nodded lightly and said, he has no ill intention. Him? J.M. and Sparrow means no harm. Danitz quickly said, Captain, regardless, he's a dangerous fellow. Are you sure he means no harm? T can't be sure, Edwina replied very calmly. Then why were you? Danitz took a silent breath, sensing the similarity between his captain and J.M. and Sparrow. They were people who he couldn't engage in a conversation with. Vice Admiral Iceberg, Edwina said with a straight face, that's just my speculation and judgment. CC0, Danitz rubbed his temples with his right hand. Anyway, he's dangerous. There's a secret organization backing him, and I've no idea about the situation of the organization. Captain, I don't think you should take the risk of communicating with him, even if he claims to have something to ask of you. Edwina thought for a moment before saying, there's no need to take risks. T can communicate with him through you. Danitz first heaved a sigh of relief before asking both curiously and expectantly, Captain, how will that work? Or should I say, what do I need to do? Edwina raised her right hand, revealing a stand and a blackboard in her dream. T need you to hold a ritual, she said. TT's called a soulfall ritual. It allows my soul to pass through the spirit world and attach itself to your body. I'll be able to converse directly with Jam and Sparrow. It works on anyone below that of a demigod, with an effective distance of no more than 500 nautical miles. TT involves reason and communication, and it belongs to the realm of the god of knowledge and wisdom. You must draw the corresponding symbols and magic labels. In mysticism, the blue star corresponds to the god of knowledge and wisdom. Mercury, brass, lavender, pepper, and mint are needed. Blue star corresponds to Saturday. The time of the blue star is from midnight to 1 on Friday and 11 to 12 noon on Saturday. Edwina explained as she wrote the key points to remember on the blackboard, and Danitz instinctively sat down and assumed a listening posture. As he listened, he suddenly felt at a loss. Why do I need to attend classes even in my dreams? In the bedroom, Klein, who was sleeping, suddenly jolted awake, having vaguely sensed something. He got out of bed and listened for a moment. In the living room, although Danitz was snoring, his breathing was calmer than before. It wasn't too strange, but it was sufficiently unusual for an experienced senior expert in mysticism like Klein, who had been through a lot. He softly walked to the door that separated the bedroom from the living room, reached for the handle, and slowly turned it. Without a sound, Klein walked out of the bedroom and saw Danitz lying in a reclining chair, fast asleep. Everything around him appeared normal. Klein quietly activated his spirit vision and checked blazing, but he didn't find anything amiss. Whether it was the color of his aura or the changes in his mood, there was nothing abnormal about him, all within a reasonable range. After watching for a while, Klein frowned and took out a silver charm. Dream charm. In the dream, Danitz was learning the soulfall ritual with a bitter expression. He had no doubt that the captain in front of him was genuine. No one can fake such a style and hobby. At that moment, he heard the sound of the lock turning. Subconsciously, Danitz looked towards the bedroom, where the crack in the door was widening, and J.M. Sparrow, who was wearing only a white shirt, walked out expressionlessly. "You? How did you appear here?" Danitz shot to his feet, blurting out in shock. He quickly snapped to his senses and stammered, This is my dream. How is J.M. Sparrow appearing so easily?" With one hand in the pocket of his dark trousers, Klein walked toward the woman who had her back to the window and said in a low voice, "A charm." Then looking directly at the woman, he asked almost with certainty, "Edwina Edwards. Her attire is a little strange. She doesn't look like an adventurer, much less a pirate. She looks like a woman with a decent job, someone who can support herself on her own. The style of her attire looks like it comes from Intis," Klein thought, feeling somewhat unaccustomed. Edwina nodded slightly and similarly replied with a question, "J.M. Sparrow." "Yes, good afternoon, ma'am." Klein smiled slightly, pressed his hand to his chest and bowed. Edwina nodded and replied, "Good afternoon." Klein, who was maintaining his persona, stopped talking, waiting for the other side to take the initiative to ask him about his purpose. He looked at Edwina. Edwina looked at him. There was a sudden silence in the dream for several minutes. From time to time, Danitz looked to the right and to the left, having a baffling feeling that perhaps all of this might really be a dream. Unable to tolerate the situation, Danitz decided to do something about the situation. He coughed twice and faced Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards and said, "Captain, Mr. J.M. Sparrow has some questions for you." Phew, Klein let out a sigh of relief. If this stare-down continued, he felt as though his persona would collapse. Edwina gently nodded her head, looked at Klein and said, "Mr. Sparrow, have you received education?" "What kind of question is this?" Klein's expression didn't change as he indifferently replied, "University graduate." Danitz looked at J.M. Sparrow in surprise, unable to believe the fact that this crazy adventurer and bounty hunter had actually gone to university and even graduated. He had no way of putting a university, a hallmark of wisdom, with that of J.M. Sparrow together. Unless it's some Hunter University or Killer Academy, or a university that exists only in the fantasies of madmen and psychopaths, Danitz couldn't help but lampoon silently. Edwina didn't seem surprised. She continued to ask, "What languages have you mastered?" CC9 Klein resisted the urge to frown and said, "Jotun, Elvish, Dragonese, Ancient Hermes, Ancient Faeseklonese." Edwina responded tersely. "Do you understand the other domains in mysticism?" Feeling adrift for a moment, Klein felt like he had returned to his previous life's elementary school day. Due to his age handicap, he had been asked a series of questions by a teacher, such as how many Chinese characters he had mastered, if he had mastered the 4 arithmetic operations, whether he knew the English alphabet, and how many Tang Dynasty poems he could recite. "Calm down. You're J.M. Sparrow now," Klein once again said without emotion. "Adept." Edwina thought for 2 seconds and then explained in an unhurried manner, "I have to combine your standard of knowledge with how I would answer the questions so that you can understand the answers more easily." This, Klein was surprised to find that the beautiful lady in front of him was nothing like an adventurer acting as a part-time pirate. She was basically a teacher with a cold expression, but a kind and patient attitude. He calmed down after thinking about the vampire that headed for the Church of Mother Earth daily. "This is the first pirate admiral I'm officially meeting. She's indeed unique," Klein secretly sighed and said, "First question, where do beyonder creatures appear at sea?" "The commonly seen ones." He didn't directly ask about mermaids, as he didn't want her to see through his real purpose, which would lead to unnecessary accidents. Edwina thought for a moment, and then wiped the soulful ritual off the blackboard. She then wrote and drew, "Set off from Sanya Island, sail 1,200 nautical miles in this direction, and you'll enter the depths of the sea which humans have never explored. There is a Naga tribe active there. They've been working hard to find the underwater city, which is rumored to have a powerful demon sealed within. That's the entity of their faith. Edwina spoke in detail, partly from her own efforts to find the treasure itself, and partly from the knowledge and rumors she had exchanged. It took her a while to finish the general story, but to Klein's dismay, there were no mermaids anywhere except in the eastern waters of the Gargas archipelago. He quickly calmed his mood and said, "Second question, do you know how to remove the mental corruption from a Beyonder characteristic?" He didn't hide the fact that he knew about Beyonder characteristics. Edwina's eyes flickered for the first time, as though she had a new understanding of Jayam and Sparrow. She shook her head. "I don't know. However, I once imagined that it's possible by borrowing the power of an external force and completely crushing the corrupted Beyonder characteristic to reduce it to the smallest specks of light. This way, whether it's corrupted or cursed, they will scatter having lost their vessel. They would rapidly or slowly vanish. As for the shattered Beyonder characteristic, it will gather bit by bit due to their particular traits, eventually taking form again. Unfortunately, only gods can do this. If you get the favor of any god, you can try to please them by offering enough sacrifices and pray for a response." The law of convergence of Beyonder characteristics. In his mind, Klein filled in what Edwina had purposely left out. At the same time, he couldn't help but sigh. This Vice Admiral Iceberg, captain of the Golden Dream, was extremely knowledgeable in mysticism. She wasn't worse than him, someone who had read many of Roselle's diary entries and had experienced many things. It was said that Vice Admiral Iceberg can replicate or simulate the Beyonder powers of her opponents when they use them in front of her. This is rather similar to Mr. Isengard Stanton's 2081 ring. As soon as Klein's thoughts began to wander, he forcefully reined them back, and he nodded as if he was thinking about something. "Do you agree with this hypothesis?" "Regretfully, I haven't done it in practice. It's only a conjecture." Edwina rarely used a word that described emotion. Danitz, who had been listening by the side, had a dazed look on his face. He was unable to keep up with the conversation at all. "What are they talking about? What are they discussing? Why do I know every word, but know nothing when they're strung together? What's a Beyonder characteristic? What does shattering it do? What does it gathering together represent?" Danitz looked left and right, his eyes blank. At this point, Klein threw out the third question he had thought about. "Where can you find ancient wraiths?" He only mentioned this kind of monster, because the corresponding ingredients could also be used in the domain of death. It didn't expose the secrets of his own sequence. Edwina glanced at Danitz and said, "I'll keep an eye out for you. If you want to attend Bayam's Beyonder gatherings, he knows a few. He can take you there." "Not bad, it's easier to talk to smart people," Klein added. "Do you know where there are people who can make mystical items out of Beyonder ingredients or characteristics?" "I met one at a gathering, but he never showed up again," Edwina answered frankly. "I have grasped the corresponding knowledge. I can simulate it, but I cannot guarantee the success rate." "Heh, I'll wait then." Klein didn't harp on the topic and switched to asking, "How much do you know about Death's Key?" "Little." An iron-black key suddenly appeared in Edwina's hand. It was about the size of a lyre, its shape was ancient, and it had a dark luster. The pirate admiral said while half-carrying the item from the shipwreck, "If you mean this key, then I can tell you that it belongs to the giants." Klein glanced sideways at Danitz. "Your bosun told me that it can also belong to a dragon or a demonic wolf." "That was the earliest guess. I've recently found some historical document, and with the help of the other items on the ship, I have a rudimentary idea." Edwina didn't show any agitation. She was filled with patience, but her expression remained cold. After finally regaining his sense as the owner of the dream, Danitz curiously asked, "Captain, is it really the giants?" "Yes." Edwina gave an affirmative answer. That batch of documents showed that there were still many giants active in the fourth epoch. Some of them had switched faiths to the god of combat, while the others were left scattered, becoming the hunting targets of the human. One of the tribes built a ship and tried to find the lost giant king's court at sea, never to return. The sunken ship we discovered, along with some of the items inside, are very similar to the relics they left behind in their original settlement, so we have sufficient reason to believe that the key belongs to the giants, and it is very likely to be pointed towards the lost giant king's court of their race before the cataclysm. Giant King's Court. Little son said it's not far from the city of Silver. Klein didn't say a word, but he quietly listened to Vice Admiral Iceberg's description. I have to say, the city of Silver and the forsaken land of the gods are things I know that completely surpasses other Beyonders. Even the seven gods can't find that place, or they find it hard to figure out the exact situation. In this aspect, I'm stronger than them. Klein thought about it with a smug and self-deprecating manner before saying in a deep voice, "If I offer a sufficient price, are you willing to sell the key?" Of course, unless I acquire additional clues to the Giant King's court. Edwina continued to speak at a moderate pace. Very good, if the Tarot Club organizes an expedition to the Giant King's court one day, I will buy this key. Klein was about to ask the last question when he suddenly remembered the four adventurers. Relying on the power of the dream charm, he conjured the lady with greenish-gray eyes, who wore a man's shirt, and her three companions. Do you know them? Edwina took a glance and said almost without thinking, Letitia Dolra, an archaeologist and adventurer. Rumor has it that she's a member from the Moses Ascetic Order, or the Element Dawn. Moses Ascetic Order, the ancient organization that believes in the hidden sage, it really isn't for money, and their goal is definitely something from the abandoned temple. Klein asked casually, what do you know about Element Dawn? This mysterious organization was similar to the psychology alchemists, having been born in the recent 1 to 200 years. It combined the elements of various schools of mysticism. It had its own set of theories, and its members were all proficient in spell casting and had mastery in many ancient witchcraft techniques. Edwina pursed her lips and said, they've always been fighting against the Moses Ascetic Order. Rumor has it that the eldest daughter of Emperor Roselle, Bernadette Gustave, established it. The Element Dawn is headed by Bernadette. Zaratul's prophecy is quite accurate after all. She can really be considered an important figure in the Beyonder world. Klein sighed inwardly, feeling somewhat enlightened. He resisted the urge to sigh and looked at Edwina. He calmly said, one last question. When the beautiful lady and blazing Danitz's attention was fully focused on him, he slowly opened his mouth. Are you interested in cooperating? What kind of cooperation? Edwina returned with a question. The smile on Klein's face became more and more exuberant. With a hint of madness in it, he said, Hunt Admiral of Blood. What? Hunt Admiral of Blood. Danitz almost raised his right hand to his ear. His first reaction was that he had misheard. However, Jayaman Sparrow's smile with hidden madness and the slight movement of his captain's eyebrows, an abnormality of hers, reminded him that what was said had really happened. This madman Jayaman Sparrow really is daring. This is one of the 7 pirate admirals. They aren't people that a character like Steel Mavetti can be compared with. Danitz's pupils shrank, his heart on the brink of roaring. Putting aside the fact that Admiral of Blood Center's own might, just the pirates underneath him are intimidating enough. His first mate, third mate, and the captains of each ship are all capable of independently leading a large pirate crew. There are still many of the crew which Steel Mavetti had brought to Bayam with him in the Blood Pirate crew. When Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos died silently like a wild dog in Backland, it was mainly because he wasn't with his pirate crew. However, Admiral of Blood Center is different. He seldom leaves his flagship and rarely leaves the company of his men. Even if the focus is placed back on Center's strength, it would still be extremely terrifying. He's mysterious, bizarre, and is one of the few powerhouses at the sea who is second only to the 4 kings. Even Captain might not dare to claim to be his superior. A madman's guts really does exceed my imagination. No, he doesn't know the meaning of fear at all. The death and replacement of a pirate admiral will definitely be a great shock to the 5C. One thought after another flashed through Danitz's mind, but in the end, he strangely calmed down. It was because he recalled that Jayaman Sparrow was a powerhouse at the level of the 7 admirals, and there might be a hidden, terrifying organization backing it. Edwina said after a few seconds of silence, do you know of the Rose School of Thought? Not only do I know them, I've also killed their people and taken their mystical items. Wait a minute, why do I have to describe myself as a bad guy? Klein converged his smile and said in an unperturbed manner, I've hunted their members. Edwina fell silent again. Next to her, Danitz once again had various thoughts. What are they talking about? What's the Rose School of Thought? Where am I? Whose dream is this? After a short moment of silence, Edwina said, after the huge battle with Vice Admiral Dusk's pirate crew, Center's crew vanished. At present, no one knows where they are. One will have to wait patiently. Is this an agreement? Klein once again revealed a smile. T, do not lack patience. How can I contact you? Edwina turned her head to look at Danitz. He knows how. Me? Sofa ritual. Wait a minute, Captain. You mean I have to follow this madman Jayaman Sparrow during this period of time? No. Who knows when this fellow will go crazy? With a start, Danitz quickly opened his mouth and said, Captain, I've already left the Golden Dream for too long. I've missed too many lessons. I can't wait to return. He tried his hardest to show his sincerity in his eyes, filling them with the desire for knowledge. I believe we can switch to someone else like Iron Skin and Barrel. Before he finished his sentence, Edwina suddenly raised her right hand and pressed it against her ear. She looked slightly to the side and said without expression, What did you say? T couldn't hear it. Roselle's dream spell is reaching its limits. The pirate admiral's skirt fluttered slightly as she took a step back before her figure quickly turned faint, reducing into points of fragmented light. The rest of Danitz's words were left stuck in his throat. He stretched out his right hand in an attempt to grasp something, but he ended up weakly drooping down. Roselle's dream spell. The Emperor's presence in the field of mysticism is also quite formidable. The full name of the Vice Admiral Iceberg is Edwina Edwards. Isn't this the surname of one of the Emperor's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? A descendant. However, from the tone of Vice Admiral Iceberg, she isn't familiar with the eldest daughter of the Emperor, Bernadette. They might not even know each other. Klein looked at Danitz, whose expression had completely collapsed, and let out a soft laugh. Perhaps one day I will call you Mr. 10,000 pounds. Danitz straightened his back in fright. Then he saw Jayaman Sparrow's figure disappear from his dream. If I were only sequence 7 and had a bounty of 7 or 8,000 pounds, then I would be targeted everywhere I go. Danitz stood rooted in his dream, his head hurting the more he thought about it. In the evening, Danitz looked at Jayaman Sparrow, who was dressed as a native. Today, we'll be visiting the location faction. We might be able to find some good things there. Heh, they have a great need for Beyonder ingredients, food, and weapons. At this point, Danitz looked Jayaman Sparrow up and down. It was rare for him to find something that he was better than him at. He said with a smile, their area is filled with local people. There aren't even many people with mixed blood. If there's even the slightest signs of an abnormality in their clothing, you will be discovered. Your pantaloons and brown jacket are fine, but you can't wear a shirt inside. A real native wears Taraba shirts. They're similar to sea soul shirts, but they're either all blue or white. They don't wear caps, headscarves, or anything. Also, people like you who look obviously Lonese will encounter very serious discrimination and hostility there, just like a wolf that sneaks into a flock of sheep. You can't hide your existence at all. Before he could finish, he saw Jayaman Sparrow tilt his head and look at him. His deep facial features quickly turned soft. His fair skin was instantly stained with the color of bronze. In just a snap, he had become an undeniable native that didn't stand out in any way. T4. After a few seconds of silence, Danitz laughed dryly as if nothing had happened. Me too. I have to disguise myself. Your disguise? Klein took off his cap and sat down. What local faction? It actually trades Beyonder ingredients, food, and weapons. To put it simply, the resistance. Danitz suddenly wasn't sure if Jayaman Sparrow had any connections with the lone official. Klein was startled for a second. Resistance? Danitz smiled awkwardly and said, people who clamor for independence and for natives to administer their local affair. Their encampment is deep in the woods or at sea. They cooperate with many pirates and adventurers. Of course, the ones backing them are mainly people from Fasak and Inti. Often, there will be priests from the god of combat and the eternal blazing sun secretly coming over. Bayam isn't that calm after all. After leaving the kingdom and coming to the sea, Klein finally understood what it meant by an international situation. This wasn't something that could be compared to reading about wars in East Balam from the paper. He nodded slightly and didn't object to visiting the local faction. After leaving the Wind of Azurin, Klein followed Danitz, whose face was painted black. They went through the streets, heading all the way southeast. Leaving the confines of the City of Generosity, they entered a zone filled with different architectural styles. The buildings here had raised floors, propped up by wooden piling. There were 3- or 4-story buildings that had evolved from the Lone-style terrace houses. The roads that split from each other were narrow and dirty, with many stalls on either side. They sold all kinds of headgear, earrings, and accessories made of stone. They were mostly bright red or multicolored. What a bunch of strange fellows. They especially like bright colors, just like those venomous snakes in the forest, Danitz whispered. As someone from Intis, you aren't much better either. You advocate the color of gold, and advocate a sense of luxury and exquisiteness, just like a nouveau-rich Klein lampoon. They passed by a group of dark-skinned, skinny, and shriveled natives, entering the alleys which had clothes drying over their heads. The scene before their eyes suddenly opened up, revealing a small municipal square. On the square, a group of locals was gathered around the central pond. Some were kneeling, some were prostrating, some were mumbling, and some were singing softly. They had devout expressions, but they looked numbed. As soon as they realized that someone was approaching, they quickly got up and ran into the surrounding alleys in a flurry. All the windows on the second, third, and fourth floors of the surrounding houses clanged shut, and the square grew quiet, but Klein's spiritual perception told him that there were many people behind the windows, around the alleys, in the dark corners, watching these strangers who had suddenly arrived in their world. Danitz lowered his head and said in a suppressed voice, "Don't worry, this is their way of protecting themselves." "Oh?" Klein expressed his doubts. Danitz let out a chuckle. Before this place was completely colonized, the natives on the Rörsted archipelago always believed in sea god Kalvatu. They believed that this deity who appears in the form of a gigantic sea serpent would protect all the islands here, preventing them from being devoured by earthquakes or tsunami. Now that this belief has been outlawed, the Church of the Lord of Storms has been constantly fighting against the heretics. Even the Church of Evernight and the Church of Steam and Machinery are unable to expand their influence here, and there are only a few cathedrals. But in fact, how can the faith that has been in place for centuries, if not a millennium, be so easily eradicated? There are still plenty of believers of the sea god in Bayam, Blue Mountain Island, and the Rörsted Sea. Even if a bunch of people are captured every 1 to 2 months, a situation in which they suffer all kinds of extreme punishment, it's impossible to reverse this situation anytime soon. The Resistance's main pillar of support are the believers of the sea god. In my opinion, it will take at least another 100 years before the faith of the sea god will be completely eradicated. Of course, that's under the premise that there aren't any other disruptive elements. Sea god Kalvatua, its image is of a gigantic sea serpent. As Klein listened thoughtfully, he followed Danitz into a 4-story house on the right. He went to the top floor via a narrow staircase. Knock, knock, knock. Danitz knocked on the door to his left. "Who is it?" someone asked in a low voice. Danitz replied with a chuckle, "A friend who brings wine and barbecue." "Where from?" the person inside asked a strange question. Danitz stepped back. "At sea." Creak. The door slowly opened, and Klein saw a naked arm. The arm was tattooed with a blue, hideous sea serpent. Reception behind the door was a bare-chested man with a hideous blue sea serpent tattooed on his arm and short streaks of red paint, painted on the sides of his cheeks, chest, and abdomen, each group formed out of 3 streaks. Really exotic, however. Aren't you afraid of being too conspicuous? Aren't you afraid of being caught by the police while you're outside? You're part of the resistance that engages in secret operation. Klein was about to retract his gaze when he was almost forced to frown by the man's thick, messy eyebrows and cold-blooded eyes. He has killed many people. Klein made a rough judgment based on his spiritual intuition. Honestly speaking, due to his previous life's identity and knowledge, he initially held a lot of sympathy for the rebels under colonial rule. However, after hearing that the man and the followers of the sea god Kalvatua basically engaged in the same acts, he became even more wary and repulsed. This wasn't to say that he discriminated against the local faith, but rather, he understood that the traditional faith of all the colonial islands was still in a primitive stage that believed in sacrifice. They worshipped with food and blood, using living sacrifices, and were still in a state of complete ignorance. In addition, with the experiences of the Emperor and myself, the beyonder nature of this world is filled with madness and twistedness. A deity, still in the primitive stage of sacrifice, is basically unable to resist this trend. It's quite obvious what kind of style they follow. Without a word, Klein followed Danitz into the room. "Edmonton, who's here?" A mild voice sounded from the area near the window. The tattooed man closed the door and said, "They've disguised themselves." At that moment, Klein had taken a good look at the situation in the room and gained a basic understanding of it. The living room wasn't very large. A cupboard, a table, and a few chairs were enough to make it look cramped. To the right were two doors leading to what appeared to be a bedroom. To the left was a kitchen, separated by a cabinet. As for the washroom, there was no doubt that there wasn't one. When Klein went upstairs, he discovered that there was a common washroom at the corner of each flight of stairs. The stench of them not being washed for extended periods of time urged any passers-by to walk up faster. Directly in front of him was a window. Two bamboo poles hung out and were used to hang a lot of clothes to dry. There were 4 or 5 men sitting or standing in the bedroom's doorway and the living room. All of them were dark-skinned natives with slightly curly hair. They wore dark blue taraba shirts and more or less had red paint on their bare skin. And as for the sea serpent tattoo, Klein couldn't tell if it was there or not because of the clothing. Some of them had revolvers at their waists, some carrying brownish-red hunting rifles. Some even carried gray steel backpacks and long, thick high-pressure steam rifles. They formed a semicircle around Danitz and Klein, who had just entered the room. The person who spoke was a wheelchair-bound man in his 40s. He wore a jacket and had a blanket over his knees. He had a shaved head, a slightly green beard on both sides of his face, and his dark brown eyes were calm and collected. He glanced at his visitor and slowly smiled. Blazing. Danitz was stunned for a moment before forcing out a laugh. Khaled, you have a good eye. Dogshit. Am I so bad at disguising myself? He roared inwardly, unwilling to accept the fact. Khaled ignored Blazing's insincere praise and instead chuckled. He heard that you killed Steel and Blood Brambles. How else would they be dead? Danitz retorted without hesitation. Khaled narrowed his eyes, slowly shifting his gaze to Klein, who had a featureless face. He knew very well that Blazing Danitz alone would have a hard time killing Blood Brambles Hendry, much less Steel Mavetti. His success was rumored to be due to the help of a powerful adventurer, a seasoned bounty hunter. Is it the person beside him? When he looked into Klein's eyes, he didn't see any nervousness, worry, or vigilance. Those eyes were like a deep ocean. It could very well be, at the very least, he's stronger than Blazing. He signaled to Edmonton and the others with his eyes, secretly informing them to be on their guard. What are you doing here? Khaled didn't pursue the subject. Danitz subconsciously looked at Klein, and after seeing his nod of affirmation, he replied, Here to see what good things you have to offer. Khaled pointed to a table and said, It's all placed there. There were many strange and different items laid out, including a whistle made of bone, a simple and crude bagpipe, an iron-black leaf, and a rock stained with blood. Without waiting for Klein and Danitz to examine the items, Khaled clapped his hands and said, I have a mission. If you can complete it, you can freely choose an item from these at no additional cost. He laughed and added, By the definition of you foreigners, they aren't mystical objects, but they all have some supernatural power, but it will slowly, yes, slowly weaken until it disappears. What mission? Klein asked calmly, having no intention of hiding the fact that Danitz was only a follower. He reached into the blanket that extended to his knees and took out a stack of white paper. Find out where they are. If you can catch them directly, you will get even more. He raised his arms and began to display lifelike portraits, including a lady with greenish-gray eyes dressed in a man's shirt. Letitia Dolra. Klein recognized who the resistance was looking for at a glance. It was the female archaeologist and adventurer he had met last night and had boarded the same ship with this morning. She was suspected to be a member of the Moses Ascetic Order, or the Element Dawn. Danitz looked at it closely for 2 seconds and found the picture vaguely familiar. Suddenly, he remembered where he had seen her before. Jamin Sparrow had shown it in his dream. He had just asked the captain about it in the afternoon, and were already bumping into something relevant in the evening. Isn't he too resourceful at gathering information? Danitz resisted his urge to glance at the crazy adventurer beside him, afraid that Khaled and Edmonton would notice something amiss. He was very experienced in this area. The resistance, who believe in the sea god, are looking for Letitia. The faith of the sea god spreads throughout the Rorstad archipelago, including Simim. There was a snake last night. The image of the sea god is that of a gigantic sea serpent. Klein superimposed the two matters together and quickly came to a preliminary conclusion. Archaeologist Letitia and company had obtained an important item involving the sea god in the Forgotten Temple in the ancient forest of Simim Island. Hence, it resulted in last night's probing and the resistance's search. Klein thought for a moment, then he gave a perfunctory reply. I'll keep an eye out. I won't randomly get myself involved in matters related to evil spirits. Of course, if it's necessary, then I will report it to the officials. He silently added a few words inwardly. Khaled nodded and said, take a look first and see if there's anything you want. Klein walked over and was just about to inquire as he made his selection when he suddenly sensed something and subconsciously looked towards the right side of the item pile. There was a short sword made of thin bone. It was slightly longer than a forearm and had a milky white body. There were a few dark red deep stripes on it. It can trigger my spiritual perception. Klein stretched out his right hand in an attempt to pick up the sharp bone sword that was placed right at the front, to carefully examine it. The moment his fingers touched the bone sword, cries of despair and pain suddenly echoed in his mind. A thick stench of blood faintly appeared at the tip of his nose, and he seemed to see many distorted and rotten illusory figures that were covered in mucus. Klein's forehead ached, as though he had been pierced by a needle, and he subconsciously retracted his finger. A little sinister, it's not a simple item. Klein, who had experienced things far more intense before, only showed a slight change in expression. He resisted the urge to activate his spirit vision, afraid that he would see something he shouldn't. Noticing this, Khaled exchanged glances with Edmonton and said with a smile, this bone sword is capable of draining an enemy's blood. It's not bad. Do you want it? A little proactive, Klein frowned, relaxed his brows immediately, and then he said in a deep voice, no, there's nothing I want here. If Khaled hadn't asked, he was even planning on buying the bone sword and researching it above the gray fog. However, the fact that the man promoted it had left him vigilant. Thus, he rationally abandoned his original plan. Khaled crossed his hands and said, it's not expensive at all. Or would you like to look at something else? There's no need. Klein's pupils shrank suddenly as he turned and walked straight towards the door. Danitz hesitated momentarily before hurrying after him. Edmonton, who had a sea serpent tattoo on his arm, watched silently. He seemed as if he would reach out and stop them at any moment, but in the end, he didn't do anything. They were the powerful adventurers who had killed Steel Mavetti and Blood Brambles Hendry. Once out of the room, Klein stomped down the stairs without saying a word. Danitz ran after him, alarmed. Based on his take of the situation, he didn't inquire about the situation and only followed. The two quickly returned to the square, and the crowd which had gathered once again to either kneel or prostrate scattered once more. But unlike before, there was a man who had still remained kneeling on the ground, motionless. Klein didn't even glance at him as he walked past without stopping. However, Danitz had taken a subconscious look, only to discover that the man's face was as dry as a weathered rock. Puh! A piece of flesh from the man's cheek fell to the ground. It was a piece of grayish skin with facial hair attached to it. He seemed to have lost all the moisture in his body. Danitz was startled and didn't dare to look again, feeling that things had become strange and dangerous at some point. The two of them passed through the alleys, left the city, and boarded a rental carriage. The carriage driver was obviously a native, around 40 years old, and his laughter was very pleasing. But along the way, he didn't say a word. It was so quiet that it made Danitz feel like his heart was beating like a drum. Klein pursed his lips and remained silent. The rental carriage quickly arrived at the dock area. In order to change his attire, Danitz got it to stop a distance from Acid Lemon Street. After getting off the carriage, Klein didn't pay the fare or stop. He immediately took large strides and left, leaving Danitz stunned. He tossed two solely to the carriage driver and hurriedly chased after Jam and Sparrow. After a few steps, he looked back and saw the driver kneeling down with a face full of zeal and devoutness. He leaned over the ground and kissed the ground where Klein had stepped.